we've set up the lighting and all the reflections and shadow plates and everything in the shot. Now I want to set it up for render. I did add some animation. It still needs, I'll finalize the animation, but you need to kind of finalize the animation before you can render this shot. So okay, but once that's done, we're going to set up all the passes we need for this render. Basically, we're going to render things out separately and combine it together in a compositor. So to do that, we have to first put all our things in collections so we can actually activate these collections and set them up for rendering each pass, setting, activating, deactivating what we want to see in it. So basically, we need to render four things. We're going through the basics of multi-layer rendering. So you have four passes you want to render. You can go way further than that. There's a lot of extra layers you can render, but I just want to go through the basics, what you pretty much need for every single shot. So first we're going to render the van on its own. Then we'll render the shadow that it casts on the floor, and then we'll render a depth pass. So depth pass, let me just have a look here. I'm just going to make another window. The depth pass looks like this. Okay, something like this. So the further something is away from the camera, in this case it gets lighter, in this case it gets darker. It doesn't really matter which way you have it around. It's just that you have a color representation of the distance away from camera for your objects. With this we can set up a depth of field. We can change the depth of field and animate the depth of field in the compositor, so we can decide where we want our focus of our camera to be based on the color of this pass. Another pass we have to render is ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion, that looks like this. Okay, so an ambient occlusion pass renders out everything white except where things are in contact. So contact shadows, and then between objects where light won't bounce and illuminate as much, it renders darker areas. So we can use this as an overlay for our shot and darken the areas that shouldn't have that much light and would have contact shadows, which isn't necessarily cast shadows from our lights, but we still want those contact areas for detail and believability. Okay, and then I'm going to add an extra pass to this one. Not all of you will need it, but if you had, like I showed in last week in the monkey render where the monkey was reflecting in the table, I'm just going to render a reflection pass in this shot so that you know how to do that. So that's an extra one we need here. So something being reflected onto the surface it's standing on. Okay, so I want to start setting up the collections first. So in this collection that I already have is everything in my van. So I'm just going to call that van. However, I'm going to take everything that is its reflection, like casting reflections onto it or shadows onto it. I'm going to put that in a separate pass because I want to isolate it when I do depth renders and things like that. So I'm just going to move that new collection, and I'm going to say let's say reflection caster. Okay, so that casts reflections and also casts shadows. So all those plates, and I need the one, if I've named it correctly, this one is shadow catcher, so I need the other one, which should be in here, reflection catcher. Okay, reflection caster. So that's the road for my background image, casting reflections into my van here. Okay, so that's all into one group. I'm going to hide that. Okay, then this one is my shadow catcher. I'm going to put that in its own collection. So M to make it to move its collection, new collection. I'm going to call that shadow. Okay, and then I'm also going to put my lights in its own collection. Let's hide the shadow. So I know I've done that, and let's hide the van. Okay, I'm also going to put the lights in the collection. So M, new collection, lights. So that way I do that just to make sure that everything is in the collection. Oh, there's a circle thing here, which is a remnant from something I did, so I don't know what, just deleting that. I put the lights in there so that it's a bit more organized. Also, in some cases, you want to deactivate lights for certain parts. We probably won't do it in this render, but it is possible if you want to have things not affected by lights, or have lights not be glossy in certain reflections and things like that. So I always put my lights into a group. For this render, I'm going to keep it active all the time because it needs to light stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to bring everything back. So here we have the collections that we need for this render setup, except I don't have something that will actually receive reflection. So if I wanted to put reflection on the ground, in some shots you need to. I don't need in this one, but I'm going to do it as a kind of demonstration. So I'm just going to take the shadow catcher and duplicate it, because I know that's on the ground. Move that into a new collection, reflection catcher. Okay, I'll hide the shadow catcher then. Name this plane that I made reflection catcher. Actually, I don't. I guess yeah, that makes sense. Catcher. Um, I need to make sure that it's set up to catch reflections. Because it's duplicated from the shadow catcher, make sure you switch off shadow catcher so it doesn't just render shadows. And I'm going to put a shader on it. New shader, and this shader is no roughness and it's metallic, so that it reflects. If I render it, it reflects our background. If I switch on my van, it should reflect the van. We're eventually going to remove the background from it. Okay, so that is the reflection catcher. Okay, I think that's all we need. They're all I'm going to switch them all on. Now I want to set up the layers that we need. So yes, we need the van as a layer. So if you look at the top here, this will be default be called view layer. So these view layers is the things, the separate layers we're going to render out. So every time we want to render something separately, we need to make a view layer for it. So the first one we want is van. Okay, I'm just going to make them all and then I'll set them up. Then we want a new one called shadow. That's the shadow on its own. For some reason I already had one. Okay, I can delete that one. Okay, van shadow. Make a new one. I just make new completely. I don't copy settings or anything. Just new. Then we want the reflection that it casts onto the ground, and then we want the ambient occlusion and depth. That I can do in the same pass. You can technically get it from your color render, but it won't make contact shadows on the ground because that won't be visible in the render. Or will it? I'm not thinking, because I'm gonna have the shadow pass, the shadow catcher in there. I think it might. Actually, I usually just make it its own pass. Let's say I'm gonna make AO/depth. I'm gonna make one there, and we'll see. Okay, so that's the ones. So I'm going to render both the ambient occlusion and depth in the same render. I can extract them both from the same thing. Okay, so let's go to the van. If I now render this, I can see the render here, but I usually just make a proper render. Okay, so it's now rendering everything together, which is not what we want. But I'm just checking my render settings here. I'm just dropping quality real quick, so I can, if I do press F12, I can get a quicker result to see what I'm doing. Okay, so on this van render, I now need to tell it what to render and what not to render. All right, so by default, you won't see that or that. I don't think. Maybe not even that. Okay, I don't know. So those filters that aren't all visible by default. So I'm going to switch all of these things on, the restriction toggles. Okay, so that gives me the options of activating, deactivating stuff in the render. So you have this little tick box that will activate it from rendering or not. At the end here, you have a little circle that is holdout. That is a mask. We don't need masks for this shot, but I'll explain what they are in a second. And then the last one is indirect only. That is, it will only render its secondary ray. So you won't actually see the object being rendered, but you'll see the shadows that it casts or the reflections that it casts. Okay, so on the van render, we need the van, so that's active. We don't need we do need the reflection caster, because the reflection is going to be casting onto this and the shadows, so we do need that. We don't need the shadow. We'll switch that off. We do need the lights. We don't need the reflection catcher because that's going to be on its own. So that is, I've got the van, the reflection caster, and the lights active. I've pressed F12. We should see just our van being rendered. Okay, that with the road reflecting into it. Okay, it's going through all the passes. If I want to only look at the one I'm currently working on, I can go to the little pass icons here. These are all my layer properties and layer passes. If I switch on render single layer, it's only going to render one of these, the one that I'm busy with. If I don't, you see when I rendered it started the second render. That's because it's rendering that one and then jumping to, you see van, now it's going to jump to shadow and start rendering that one. If I only want to see the one I'm working on, I can switch that on it. Okay. So van is working. Let's go to shadow. Okay, and I'll switch that on so I can check it. On shadow, if I okay, I'm going to deactivate the van, deactivate reflection caster, have shadow on, have lights on, deactivate reflection catcher. If I render now, you'll see nothing. Okay, because the van isn't casting shadow, so I do need to switch it on. And if I render now, it's going to render the van and the shadow. Oh wait, sorry, I didn't. I actually switched that on. If I render now, it's going to render the van and the shadow. Yeah, like that, which I don't want. So I'm just going to switch out indirect only. So it won't render the van, but it will render its shadows. Okay, so that's what we want for the shadow plate. I'm going to untick that render single layer and go back and go to the next one. Reflection. Okay, so for the reflection, we want the van's reflections. So again, if I switch off van, switch off reflection caster, switch off shadow, we have lights and reflection catcher. That's not, it's only going to reflect the world now. So I have to switch on van and switch van to indirect only. That will give us the reflections. No. Oh, because I'm not rendering just the single layer. So let's just render that one layer. There we go. So now we only have the reflections um, in that render. Okay, then ambient occlusion and depth. So for this, okay, I do need the van layer. I don't need all these reflection caster layers because I don't actually want to see that they're there. So switch that off. I don't need the shadow layer. I don't need I do need the lights. I'm going to leave the reflection catcher on because I do need one thing on the floor. It can be the shadow as well. Um, yeah. So I can, with those on, I can switch on. You see, under the passes, there's all of these things I can render. Okay. So for the ambient occlusion depth, I want to switch on Z, that's depth, and I want to switch on ambient occlusion. Okay, that will render out both of them. I can then press F12 if I switch on render single layer. And actually, once it's rendering ambient occlusion and depth, it's showing me combined. If I drop that down, it shows me those ones I just ticked on. So depth will look like that, and AL will look like that. Okay, so that's not quite what we want. But I just want to look, maybe I can actually get the AO from the van render. If I switch to van and I switch on AO, I just want to see what it gives me. No, okay, see, it doesn't give me the floor. So that's why I need to make a separate pass. And also, I don't want all of these things in place. So, yeah, okay, that's why I'm making a separate layer for ambient occlusion and depth. If you look at this ambient occlusion, it it's not quite the way I want it. It's set on default, so it's spread quite far. I mean, it's going to put dark over there. It's making quite a lot of gray, and I want it a little bit nicer than that. I mean, the quality, the grain and stuff, just because I'm rendering low quality, but the actual spread of the ambient occlusion. If I go to my world settings, I go to ambient occlusion here. I don't tick it on because then it's going to put it on the actual render. I don't want that. I want it separately because if you tick that on, it makes everything like it overlays that white over everything and makes it really bright. But I'm going to change the distance. So if I change it to 1 and then render, okay, I think that's better. That's more along the lines of what I want. You can tweak this, but I like it relatively tight, only in the very dark areas, because we do have some shadows, and I only want it on certain places. Maybe 2 for the size of the scene might be a little bit nicer. Yeah, I think that's fine. Okay, so that's my ambient occlusion. The depth you saw was just white. We're going to sort that out before we render everything out. One other thing I need to do is just go back to my reflection. So the one that catches the reflection on the ground, um, this one, because I don't want the world to reflect in it, because okay, if the road was reflective, it will already reflect the world that is there. I don't want the actual HDRI light reflecting in it, but I can't remove it here, because if I remove it here, it removes the HDRI light completely. So what I'm going to do is, on its path settings, I'm going to switch on indirect glossiness. Okay, that means I can now I can extract only the indirect rays and not the world rays, and use that on its own. Okay, so um, now when all of this is set up, let's check. Okay, Van, I can actually render it here too and show me what I'm looking at. Okay, Van on its own. Let's look at its sparse settings. Van on its own, I need to use it for rendering. One of the reasons we do this, okay, so separating into layers gives us more control in the compositor, and we can tweak our image and get the result we want. I've never actually worked on a commercial project that we didn't separate into layers, where we just render straight out of camera. It's always set up into passes so that the compositor, whoever's doing the compositing, has more control of it. The other reason we can do this is if we have a static camera in a shot, okay, say it's a big animated world, and we have a camera that's not moving, we can separate things out and render the background on its own and only render one layer for that one image for that background, and then render the character and shadows for the whole shot, and we save a lot of time by not having to render the background multiple times, or for every single frame. Now if we want to only render one frame of something, so say we only want to render one frame of the van but all the frames of the rest, I have to tell it with this useful render thing what frame to render. So if I go to frame 1, okay, let's just switch to here. Useful rendering is on, which means it's going to render this pass. So I can hover over this and key it, and if I go to the next frame, I can switch it off and key it, and that means we'll only render it for frame 1, and then for the rest of the shot it won't render that. Okay, so that is useful information, but pretty much what we're doing now, I think you will need to render everything. Okay. Another thing on this, there's sometimes I want to actually render motion blur, or save motion blur into the render, and that is both this little vector button. Okay, if I switch on vector and I render it now, okay, and I switch to my vector, okay, it's rendering everything. Let's just stop that. Render that now. And I switch to vector, you'll see this is the dot it will use to blur stuff. Because the wheels are turning, they're brighter green, so they'll blur a little bit more, and he's moving, so there'll be a bit of blur on him, and I can put that into post, but that won't actually render reflection into render motion blur into my reflection, because it's not the secondary rays. It's actually it's post applied. The vector blur is being applied after the render. Okay, but that is a way of getting motion blur data out and saving a lot of time not having to render motion blur. But for this shot, I'm actually going to render the motion blur into the path, so I don't need that. Okay, so let's check van. I need to use it for rendering, and I want to render everything, so switch that off. So van's fine. Shadow, use for rendering, that's off. Reflection, use for rendering, and AO depth, use for rendering. Okay, so the AO and depth is actually, when I render it, it renders the color. And if you have a lot of detail, a lot of reflection, stuff like that, that frame can take quite long. So, why render it separately? And to save time, I'm going to actually give it a material that renders quicker. Okay, so I'm going to select something in the scene, just something that you know where you put it. Because I want a material that I can use as an override. So on materials, I'm going to make a new material and call it default. Now this material will not render on the roof, because this is still the material that's applied to it. If I wanted to render, I'd actually have to go into edit mode and assign it, but I don't. I just want it to be somewhere, okay, so that I can so that it exists in the scene. And as default, I'm literally just going to delete the principal, so it's just the material output, which means it's not going to receive shadow, it's not going to make color, it's not going to have reflections, so it's going to be calculated really quickly. So back on the pass, on the AO and depth, I can go all the way to the bottom, override, and pick that material. That way, when I render the ambient occlusion and depth pass, it goes a lot quicker because I don't need the color data, I don't need reflections, I don't need shadows or anything. So it just renders it black. But if I switch to my AO and my depth, it's there. Okay, so it just speeds it up a lot. Okay, so I think all my passes are working now. They're set up. Now I need to set up my rendering, so get proper quality renders out of this. So obviously we render with cycles, otherwise we can't get the shadows and reflections and stuff the way we have. CPU. Alright, so if you have a decent GPU or a decent CUDA device, you can render with GPU. If you go up to Edit Preferences and switch to System, you'll see by default it's on none. Okay, that means it's going to render with your CPU. If you switch to CUDA, it will show you all the CUDA devices or CUDA enabled devices in your computer. So on here I've got the graphics card and the CPU, both are CUDA enabled, and I'll just switch them both on. So it uses if I use that computer, will use both of them. If you don't have anything, that's fine, just render with the CPU. But this will give me a little bit more rendering power. One problem with this though is if my graphics card only has 6 or 8 gigs of memory, so let's switch here to system memory. Currently I'm using 347. You'll see that go up as you render. If that number gets bigger than your if I switch this to GPU, gets bigger than your GPU memory, your render is going to stop. Okay, it won't have space to store everything that needs to be in the memory, and yeah, the render won't finish. For this kind of shot, I think most of you should be okay. If you've got a decent GPU, you won't run out of memory. But if you do, you'll have to switch to CPU, because CPU can save. Use virtual memory of your hard drive and things and your RAM to save things. So the memory issue is not a problem. Okay, so but I'm going to use GPU compute. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. Use CPU sampling. I'm just going to click on these 3 buttons and switch that to final. Okay, final sampling 512. That is a decent quality. You shouldn't have to render too long if the scene is not massive. If you really do render too long, you can drop this a little bit, but make sure you give yourself enough time to render. At least, I'm assuming these things will render about 12 hours, but it could be longer based on how you set the scene up. Then if you do drop that, you might want to use a little bit of denoising. The NLM denoiser is pretty decent, so you can switch that on if you get a lot of noise. I'm not going to use it because I'm going to use 512 samples. The rest is fine. Then for light paths, I'm going to click on that and switch to limited. If you are on full global illumination, it makes everything 128. Limited, it makes it a lot lower. So what these things are, it's how many bounces it will calculate for the lights. Okay, so that's the total. Diffuse is color. How many times will color bounce and illuminate? 1 is good enough. Because the reflection and bounce light we usually get from glossiness. So there's 4 bounces here, which is also quite decent. Transparency, 8 bounces. So if you had like a window in front of the shot, if a light passes through that window, if it has to go through the back of it and then out the front, even if it's a flat window, that's 2 bounces, back face and front face. And that will show that window is transparent. If we have 2 windows in front of each other, it will have to go through 4 faces, and that's 4 bounces. If we had 4 of them in front of each other, it will be 8. And if we have 5, then there won't be enough transparency bounces. One of them, usually the one furthest away from the light, will be black. Okay, so depending on how much transparent objects you have in your scene, you need to make sure you have enough bounces for that, and how many of them overlap, especially. 8 is usually enough. In fact, I'm going to drop it down to 4. I should be fine with that. Same with transmission. It does similar things. It just uses the transmission shader calculator, so that it's also things like its transparency and things like translucency and also like subsurface scattering and stuff like that. Volume, we don't have any volume in the scene, so like fog or haze or anything like that. So, but I'm going to leave it on 2. Okay, so that should be fine. You can test it if you press F12 and something in this van is now like that should be transparent is now black, then you need to up your transparency. Okay, these things usually, but on default it's okay. Well, what they do is if you get fireflies, so if I render on very low quality, I should probably get some fireflies. Oh no, I switched. I increased my quality. Fireflies are little white spots. There's some, but the sampling will get rid of those, I'm sure. Um, if you get like little white spots that aren't supposed to be there, obviously that's fine because that's reflection. But sometimes you get like in random areas, you get these white spots. They're fireflies. Now, what happens is if I right click on here, you can see all those numbers at the bottom. If I go to a very bright area, maybe there, you see my value, the V is 0.9, which is actually still quite low. Sometimes it can go quite bright. And so I need around about a value of 1 for things to be illuminated properly. So if I drop this indirect lighting to 2, it should still be fine theoretically. Let's actually drop it. Okay. But, oh, now is it rendering shadow pass? Man, let's just do that quick. Okay, if I drop it to 2, the shot will probably get, yeah, it gets very dark. So 2 is way too low. So it will darken the amount of bounces and things that you're, oh no, it's because I'm rendering AO in depth. Let's just render van. I thought that was a bit dark. Okay. Okay, it does look like some of the glossy areas is a little bit darker, yeah. But 2, I still pretty much get my full illumination. So what that is for is if I do get a lot of fireflies, I can drop this number and it won't illuminate the pixels past that point. If it reaches a value of that, it's going to stop. Okay, it's going to stop the illumination, and that will get rid of fireflies. So if you do get on 10, do get a lot of fireflies, drop that a little bit. 8, 7 usually gets rid of most fireflies. You can also, if you still get something, you can up the direct light. So 0.1 for that is usually fine. So this needs to be quite small and that needs to be quite big. So that's just if you do get some weird like fireflies and spots and dots and stuff in your render. Filter gloss, you don't need to do anything. All of this should be fine. One thing to make sure of is film is set to transparent. If this isn't set to transparent, you're going to get a black background, and it happens often that with the subject where someone renders, it doesn't switch this on, they don't know what the problem is, and then they have to end up re-rendering their shot because the transparent isn't on. So make sure that's on. Everything else, performance, you can tweak if you need to because of maybe rendering times. If you use GPU, it likes a big number, 64, 128. If you use CPU, it likes a small number, 32 or like 16. Otherwise, that's pretty much all you need to set here. The default on GPU is usually fine. It does make a slight speed difference if you get the right, the right setting. Each shot is a little bit different. And then if you do end up with this very slow scene that keeps on crashing, you can use spatial splits to kind of try and optimize your memory usage a little bit better. Otherwise, everything should be fine. Okay, so yeah, that's on final, that's on limited. The most important thing is to make sure that that's final and that's limited global illumination. Then you're good. Okay, make sure you render full HD and make sure your frame rate is set and tell this to render somewhere. So I've already did some rendering. Let me just delete what I rendered earlier. Desktop, compositing, renders. Okay, I'm just going to delete those. So I'm going to tell this to render to my compositing folder. So what's going to happen is, where's desktop compositing render? I made a folder for render and I'm going to put it in there. What's going to happen is Blender's going to make a default render from the whole scene and save it. And then we're not going to use that because that render is going to set up all the other layers that we need to render, and we're going to extract renders from that. Okay, so that just needs to be set somewhere. So it does save that out. Make sure it's RGBA so you can have alpha channels, so you need transparency and things. This override button. So if you're busy rendering your shot and it crashes, or you have to stop it because you need your computer for something else or something, then you stop your render and you want to continue your rendering, but you don't want to re-render anything you've rendered already. You need to switch that off. Because if that's on, it's going to start from frame 1 again and render over all your frames that you've already rendered. So then just switch that off and then render again. Or continue your render. Okay, so everything else should be fine. It should be ready for rendering. Now we just need to set up what it's going to save out. Okay, in order to make this a little bit quicker, so you don't have to wait for all my renders, I'm just going to drop my sampling like 32, just so that we end up going a little bit quicker. So once all of that's set up, I just press F12 once. I'm just going to render one. Oh wait, I also want to add some motion blur. Let's just go to my rendering little camera, go down, motion blur. I'm going to switch that on. I do find the shutter of 0.5 quite slow. That's like the middle of a fast shutter and a slow. That's slow, that's fast. So I like putting it on like 0.2, 0.3, somewhere there. And let's just check if we're in. This car doesn't move very fast at all, but if I do render it real quick, yeah, I'm not getting much, but you might get more motion blur on your shots depending on how much your objects move. It's very slight here. I can see like maybe 1 pixel blurring, 1 pixel width blurring there. It's not. But yeah, if you want motion blur, you can switch that on. Make sure that all your layers again. I messed with this, so I need to just make sure that all my layers are going to render once I actually hit F12. Okay, so I'm just going to render. I'm going to press F12 and render a single frame into memory because I'm not ready to render yet. I need to set up all those passes to save out. Okay, so there it renders the van. Then it should render the shadow. And next is the reflection and the ambient occlusion and depth. Okay, so it's rendered like a single frame of all of those. It didn't save it out, it's just in memory. But I'm going to use that now to set up my render. So I'm going to open my compositor here. Let's go to compositor. So we're doing a kind of an initial composite to save out our frames. And then once we've rendered everything, we'll do a final composite. So to see the composite, I need to switch on use nodes. And what it makes is a render layers showing me the van render in there. And it makes a composite. So this I'm not going to use, but what it does is if I have that plugged in and I go to my render options here and go all the way down to post-processing, where is here, and compositing is ticked on, then it's going to actually render that as a layer with my renderer. We're not going to do that because we're going to save out each frame individually, so I'm actually just going to get rid of that. So usually I leave it hovering there, but we'll see. Okay. So what do we need to render out? So I need to make an output. Okay, so the file output is going to save out renders. On this file output, we have plugins for each frame that we want to render out. First one we want to render out is van. Okay, I'm just going to call it van. I'm going to make a new one, and that is shadow. I want to render out. Make a new one that is reflection. Make a new one that is ambient occlusion, so AO, and then the last one we want is depth. Okay, so that's the 5 frames you want to render out separately. So to make a viewer node, you can add a viewer, or if you have Node Wrangler installed, like I had in previous videos, then Control-Shift-Click will make a viewer. And I'm not seeing anything because I have to switch on backdrop, and it will show me what this render is I'm looking at. So I'm looking at that one's image. If I press V, I can zoom out. If I press Alt V, I can zoom in. If I press Alt middle click, I can move it around. Okay, so let's see what we're looking at here. So we're looking at the van. You can see there's, I don't need the alpha in there, I guess. I can look at, if I Control Shift click, it will jump from one plugin to the next. There's all the things I've rendered out. I just need the image. So that looks fine. That's the van on its own. I'll plug it into van. Okay. Next one I want, I'm just going to copy and paste this render layers. You can also make a new one by going to just adding a render layer. Okay, I'll collapse that. So on this render layer, I'm currently looking at van. If I click on van, I can switch to shadow. And then if I plug that image into viewer, that's the shadow. That's what we need. That's all working. Plug that into shadow. Okay, let's copy and paste it again. And the next one I want to, sorry, wrong one. That one I already saved out. The next thing I want is reflection. So let's plug the reflection in there. Okay, this is the reflection, but it's not quite working because I don't want to see the HDRI reflected in this. So that's why I ticked on that glossy indirect button. So if I switch that, I only see the van. Now it doesn't have an alpha channel. I can say set alpha and use that. Let's see. If I use that, then it removes all the dark areas. So I'm just going to put the actual alpha in there. So it doesn't actually put it. It will only be on the road, and then that black I'll remove and tweak while we do the composite. Okay, so I'm just going to use the alpha as set alpha, so I don't have black all over my shot there. Okay, and that should be fine. I'm going to put that into reflection. Okay, next one, I'm going to copy and paste that. The next one should be AO depth. So I'm just going to take the AO plug. Let's put that into a viewer real quick. So image, alpha, depth, AO. That's what my ambient occlusion looks like. So that works fine. I'll plug it in. And then the depth, I'm just going to take the depth and plug that into the viewer. That's what the depth looks like. And you can't actually see anything because, yeah, it just assigned a color between black and white, so a gray value to everything. So if I take a normalize, it will take the slight variations in color and give it, and stretch it out. Go from 0 to 1 over a distance. Now, then I can save that out. I can also, if I want to tweak it a little bit, I can put in a ramp and get more black area and less white. I mean, my shot's set up to such a point that I don't really need depth of field. I might need a little bit. I can do something like that, but I can do that in the compositor once I composite everything together. So I think what we have with the normalized node, what we have with the normalized node is it's going to work. So that what you just said, the van's looking really spooky. You can actually use this node as a fog or a haze. So if you actually use that as a color overlay. So what we might actually do that in our final render, but if you use that as a color overlay, you can actually get like a bit of fogginess, on it, and use that as a depth haze or something. Okay, so that is all of them. I'm going to close that. Okay, don't need the viewer anymore. Now I need to tell this to save out. Okay, so if I just say render it now, it's going to save these, but I save it all in that render folder. I need to actually put it, I want each one of these in their own folder. So on van, I'm going to just double / that tells it, okay, use the relative path, that path. This is / just backslash there. Well, that's pretty sure it's / or maybe it's backslash. And van again. Okay, so that it makes a folder for van. Shadow. Okay, on the shadow, I'm going to do double slash and one more and shadow. That will make a path for shadow. Reflection, double slash, reflection, ambient occlusion. So this one I'm going to at least get a folder for each one of these so it doesn't get confusing as to what renders what. Depth. Okay, I'm going to save this scene. Alright, so once I've done that, make sure all your render, so you've gone through your render settings, they should be fine. Make sure that those things are ticked off. Your render quality is set right, and if mine isn't, but once you've done that, and you save the scene, you can Control F12, and it should render it. Now let's go to my render folder. So it renders each one of those, and then once it's rendered, it saves out what I specified in the compositor. So there's the van render. Okay, so it's not save, hasn't saved out anything yet. It renders the a frame for each one of them, and that should be the last one. Then goes through the compositor. There's a little blue bar at the bottom. It shows the progress, but once it's done that, yeah, it's saved out ambient occlusion into the ambient occlusion pass. There's my ambient occlusion layer. Depth in the depth pass. There's my depth layer. Reflection in the reflection. That doesn't look right. That's odd. Shadow. Shadow works. And van. Okay, I need to check why the reflection is looking weird. Oh, it might be working. It just doesn't display properly. So I'm going to cancel this. Let's just see if I bring the reflection into here. No, that's wrong. What is wrong with the reflection? It's not plugged in. No, it is. Oh, the image isn't plugged in. Okay, for somehow my image got plugged out. What is this one? Oh, the wrong, sorry, I used the wrong image when I duplicated it. So that should be the reflection, image, and alpha. Let's see. Okay, it doesn't have a render in its memory now, so if I want to see what's going on, I have to press F12 again. So I'm just going to delete all of them. Hit Control F12. I just want to see if that was the problem. Okay, so before you just let the thing finish rendering, check each frame, see if they work. Like a mistake like that, like my reflection not rendering, that can easily happen. So I'm just waiting for one to finish. Okay, so in render, in reflection, yes, okay. That's not right. I used the wrong thing. I need to use glossy indirect. Okay. Sorry, just making sure. The other ones seem fine. Ambient occlusion, depth, reflection, that's the one that's wrong. Shadow is working, and van. Okay. It's overwriting those frames now because I've got overwrite ticked on. So it should be ticked on there. That looks better. Let's see. Yes, okay. So now the reflection is working. Now I can leave it to render. You can also, if you wanted to check the alphas and everything, you can actually drag these into a compositor in Blender and just check what they look like. There we go, alpha. Does it renders a depth? That's interesting. Okay, so that's it. That's the render setup. We once you've finished your animation, you finished your lighting, you can go through that, set up all your passes, make sure all your collections, set up the view layers, make sure that you get everything. So the minimum you need would be a color pass for your 3D object, ambient occlusion for your scene, and then a depth pass, and probably a shadow catcher. Your object will need to cast a shadow onto the environment, and then anything extra like reflections if you need that. Okay, so